Everything you believe to be true is a carefully constructed lie, and the moment you accept that lie as fact, you become controllable. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote one sentence over a century ago that, if you truly understand it, will shatter every assumption you've ever made about reality. He said, "There are no facts, only interpretations." That means everything you call truth is just one perspective designed to control you. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why seeking truth is the most dangerous trap you can fall into. Let's start with what Nietzsche actually meant when he said there are no facts, only interpretations. This isn't some abstract philosophical word game. This is a direct assault on the foundation of Western civilization. For 2,000 years, from Plato to modern science, Western culture has been obsessed with finding objective, universal, eternal truth. The truth about God, the truth about morality, the truth about nature, the truth about human beings. And Nietzsche looked at this entire project and said, "You're all deluding yourselves. There is no view from nowhere. There is no perspective-free truth. Every single claim to knowledge comes from a specific perspective, serves specific interests, and reflects specific power relations." When Nietzsche says there are no facts, he is not saying reality doesn't exist. He is saying that what we call facts are actually interpretations that have become so dominant, so socially enforced, that we forget their interpretations at all. We mistake human constructions for natural truths. We confuse our perspective for reality itself. Let me give you a concrete example from Nietzsche, his own work. In his book on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche traces the origin of Christian moral values. For centuries, people believed that Christian morality, values like humility, compassion, self-sacrifice, turning the other cheek, were universal moral truths, God-given commandments, objective facts about right and wrong. But Nietzsche did something revolutionary. He asked, where did these values actually come from? Not where do we say they came from, but historically, sociologically, psychologically, where did they originate? And what he discovered was shocking. Christian morality didn't descend from heaven. It emerged from a specific historical situation. The Jews were conquered by Rome. They were powerless, enslaved, dominated. They couldn't defeat Rome militarily, so they defeated Rome morally. They created a new value system that inverted Roman values. Rome valued strength, pride, conquest, nobility. The Jews, through Christianity, revalued everything. They said, actually, weakness is strength. Humility is virtue. The meek shall inherit the earth. The last shall be first. This wasn't divine revelation. This was what Nietzsche called slave morality, a moral system created by the powerless to psychologically defeat the powerful. Now here is the key insight. Once Christianity became dominant in Europe, these values became facts, became truth, became objective moral reality. People stopped seeing them as one historical perspective among many. They became the truth about human morality, and anyone who questioned them was evil, a heretic, immoral. This is how interpretation becomes fact. Through power, through social enforcement, through generations of repetition, until no one remembers that it was ever just one perspective. Nietzsche called this process the will to power, and it is not unique to religion. It happens everywhere. In science, in politics, in education, in media. Whoever has power gets to define reality, gets to say what counts as a fact, gets to determine what is true and what is false. And once they've established their interpretation as truth, they use that truth to maintain their power. Let's talk about science for a moment, because most people think Okay, maybe morality is subjective, maybe religion is interpretation, but science deals with objective facts, right, wrong. Or more precisely, it is more complicated than that. Nietzsche actually admired science in many ways, but he saw very clearly that science doesn't discover pre-existing truths. Science constructs models, interpretations, frameworks that work for specific purposes. Consider this. For 200 years, Newtonian physics was fact. It was truth. It described objective reality, the laws of motion, gravity, matter, space, time. These were facts about the universe. Then Einstein came along and said, actually, Newton's framework is incomplete. Space and time aren't absolute. Their relative mass bends space-time, and suddenly all those facts changed. They weren't wrong exactly. They were limited interpretations that worked at certain scales, but broke down at others. Now we have quantum mechanics, which contradicts relativity at small scales. So which one is true? Which one is fact? Neither, both. They're both useful interpretations for different domains. They're both models that work for specific purposes. But here is what is important. While Newtonian physics was dominant, it wasn't presented as one useful model among many. It was presented as truth with a capital T, objective reality, and anyone who questioned it was dismissed as ignorant or crazy. This is the pattern Nietzsche identified everywhere. An interpretation becomes dominant. It gets labeled as fact, as truth, as reality. And then it is used to silence alternative interpretations. This is intellectual tyranny disguised as objective knowledge, and it happens because we've been taught from childhood to worship truth, to seek truth, to believe that truth exists and our job is to find it and submit to it. But Nietzsche is saying, stop. Question that entire framework. Ask yourself, who benefits when I accept this as truth? What does believing this fact make me do? What does it prevent me from doing? Whose interests does this truth serve? Let's apply this to modern life. Think about the news. When a journalist says, this is what happened, they're not reporting neutral facts. They're constructing a narrative. They chose which events to cover and which to ignore. They chose which sources to trust and which to dismiss. They chose how to frame the story, what context to include, what to leave out. They chose the language, the tone, the implications. Every single one of those choices is an interpretation, and those interpretations serve interests. Maybe the interests of the news organization's owners, maybe political interests, maybe ideological interests, maybe just the interest of getting clicks and views. But the story is presented as fact, as what really happened, as truth. And if you question it, you're called a conspiracy theorist or a denier. This is the mechanism Nietzsche exposed. Interpretation presented as fact to shut down questioning. Or think about education. When you went to school, you were taught facts, dates, names, events, definitions, formulas, and you were tested on your ability to memorize and repeat those facts. But who decided what facts to teach you? Who decided which history is important? Which scientific theories to emphasize? Which authors to read? Which perspectives to include? And which to exclude? Those decisions were made by people with power, curriculum committees, education departments, politicians, cultural authorities, and their choices reflect their interests, their values, their interpretation of what matters. But it is presented to you as objective knowledge, as facts you must learn. This is what Nietzsche meant by the herd mentality. Most people never learn to think. They learn to adopt. They absorb prepackaged truths and then defend those truths as if they personally verified every claim. But they didn't. They just obeyed. They outsourced their thinking to authorities, and that obedience is exactly what makes them controllable. Now let's go deeper into Nietzsche's concept of perspectivism. This is the philosophical framework he developed to replace the search for objective truth. Perspectivism says that all knowledge is knowledge from a particular perspective. There is no view from nowhere. There is no God's eye view of reality. Every claim to knowledge comes from somewhere, from a body, from a history, from a culture, from interests, from desires, from power relations, and different perspectives reveal different aspects of reality. Think of it like this. Imagine you're looking at a building. If you stand in front of it, you see the facade. If you walk around back, you see a different side. If you go inside, you see the interior. If you climb a nearby hill, you see it from above. If you're an architect, you see structural elements. If you're an artist, you see aesthetic qualities. If you're a historian, you see historical significance. Each perspective is real, each reveals something true about the building, but none of them is the complete objective truth about the building. And more importantly, you can't combine all the perspectives into one master perspective, because perspectives are irreducibly plural. They can't be reduced to a single view. This is what Nietzsche means by there are no facts, only interpretations. Reality is too complex, too multifaceted, too dynamic to be captured by any single framework. Every attempt to freeze reality into facts, into truth, into knowledge, is a simplification, a reduction, an interpretation that highlights certain features while ignoring others, and which features get highlighted depends on who is doing the interpreting and why. This is why Nietzsche said that the will to truth is actually a will to power, because claiming to have the truth is a way of gaining power over others. If I can convince you that my interpretation is the truth, then I control your reality. I set the terms of debate. I determine what is thinkable and what is unthinkable. I define normalcy and deviance. I create the categories through which you understand the world. This is the deepest form of power. Not physical force, not even economic control, but the power to shape consciousness itself. The power to determine what people accept as real. And this brings us to one of Nietzsche's most important insights: the death of God. Everyone knows Nietzsche for the phrase, "God is dead," but most people misunderstand what he meant. He wasn't making an atheistic argument, he wasn't celebrating, he was diagnosing a crisis. For centuries, God functioned as the ultimate guarantor of truth. God was the objective perspective, the view from nowhere, the absolute authority that grounded all other truths. Moral truths came from God. Natural truths were God's creation. Human purpose was defined by God. Everything had a foundation in divine reality. But by Nietzsche's time, in the late 19th century, European culture had intellectually killed God. Science had explained nature without needing God. Philosophy had questioned religious authority. Enlightenment thinking had made God optional. But here is the problem. If God is dead, if there is no absolute authority, no ultimate foundation, then what grounds truth? What makes anything objectively true? And Nietzsche's answer was nothing. Nothing grounds truth. Truth was always just interpretation backed by power. We just didn't want to admit it. We needed God as a comfortable fiction to avoid facing the abyss of perspectivism. And this is where it gets psychologically intense. Because if there are no facts, only interpretations, if there is no objective truth, no solid foundation, then everything becomes uncertain, unstable, contingent. Most people can't handle that. They need certainty. They need to believe that reality is fixed and knowable, that good and evil are real, that their beliefs correspond to objective truth. Without that security, they feel lost, anxious, nihilistic. So they cling to whatever truth is offered to them. They latch onto ideologies, religions, scientific consensus, political movements, anything that promises certainty, and whoever offers that certainty gains control over them. This is what Nietzsche warned about. After the death of God, after the collapse of absolute truth, most people won't become free thinkers. They'll become even more desperate for someone to tell them what is true. They'll trade one authority for another, one dogma for another. They'll go from religious truth to political truth to scientific truth, never realizing that it is all the same game. The game of using truth claims to control populations. So what is the alternative? If we can't trust truth, if facts are just interpretations, how do we navigate reality? Nietzsche's answer is the will to power applied to knowledge. Instead of asking, is this true, ask, what does this interpretation do? What does it enable? What does it prevent? Whose interests does it serve? Does it expand my power or limit it? Does it increase my agency or constrain it? Does it help me create the life I want or trap me in someone else's agenda? Truth becomes instrumental, pragmatic, perspectival. You don't seek the truth. You wield interpretations. You choose frameworks consciously based on what they allow you to achieve, and you remain aware that they're frameworks, tools, not reality itself. This is intellectual sovereignty. The ability to operate without needing the comfort of absolute truth. The strength to create your own values, your own meanings, your own interpretations without requiring external validation or objective grounding. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Consider the concept of human nature. Is there such a thing as a fixed human nature? A set of universal facts about what human beings are? Conservatives tend to say yes. Human nature is selfish, competitive, hierarchical. Therefore, capitalism and traditional authority are natural. Progressives tend to say humans are naturally cooperative, egalitarian, shaped by environment. Therefore, socialism and equality are natural. Both sides claim their view reflects objective facts about human nature. Both sides use science, history, and philosophy to support their truth. But from Nietzsche's perspective, both are doing the same thing. They're projecting their values onto reality and calling it truth. They're saying, the world should be organized according to my preferences, and conveniently, nature agrees with me. This is the will to power disguised as truth-seeking. The pragmatic approach is different. You ask, what kind of human does this interpretation create? If I believe humans are naturally selfish, how does that change my behavior, my relationships, my political choices? If I believe humans are naturally cooperative, what does that enable? What does it constrain? And you choose the interpretation that serves your goals, not because it is true in some objective sense, but because it is useful, because it gives you power to create the life and world you want. Now here is where this connects to psychological warfare and social engineering, the themes of this channel. Because once you understand that facts are interpretations backed by power, you become much harder to manipulate. Most manipulation works by establishing a false premise as truth, and then building arguments on that foundation. Politicians do this constantly. They'll say, the economy is in crisis. That is the truth claim. Then they'll say, therefore we need my policies. If you accept the first claim as fact, the second claim follows logically. But what if the economy isn't in crisis? What if that is just an interpretation designed to create fear and justify power grabs? If you question the foundation, the entire argument collapses. This is called framing. Whoever frames the situation controls the outcome. The frame is the interpretation that gets accepted as fact. And within that frame, certain actions seem logical, while others seem crazy. Change the frame, change the entire decision landscape. Advertisers use framing constantly. They create problems that don't exist, and then sell you solutions. Your teeth aren't white enough. Your house isn't clean enough. Your body isn't attractive enough. You're not successful enough. Not happy enough. Not secure enough. These are interpretations, frames, not objective facts. But once you accept them as true, you're trapped. You'll buy products to solve problems that were invented to sell you products. This is the genius of modern propaganda. It doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like facts, like truths about reality that everyone agrees on. But agreement doesn't make something true. It just means the interpretation has been successfully enforced across the population. This is what Nietzsche meant by herd morality. The herd agrees on certain truths, not because they're objectively correct, but because everyone else agrees. It is circular, self-reinforcing. And anyone who breaks from the consensus gets punished, not with arguments, with social pressure, with accusations of being crazy, immoral, dangerous. This is how truth functions as social control. Let's talk about one of Nietzsche's most controversial concepts, the Fabermensch or Overman. This is often mistranslated as Superman, which makes it sound like some kind of fascist fantasy of domination. But that is not what Nietzsche meant at all. The Fabermensch is the person who has overcome the need for external truth, who has liberated themselves from herd morality, who creates their own values instead of adopting them from authority. It is not about dominating others. It is about self-mastery, intellectual sovereignty. The Fabermensch doesn't ask, "What is true?" The Fabermensch asks, "What do I will to be true? What interpretation of reality empowers me? What values do I choose to live by?" And they take responsibility for those choices. They don't hide behind claims of objectivity. They own their perspective. This is terrifying to most people because it means there is no one to blame, no higher authority to appeal to, no universal truth to justify your choices. You become the sole author of your meaning. And that level of freedom is also a level of responsibility that most people desperately want to avoid. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy is so dangerous to systems of power, because if people truly understood perspectivism, if they truly internalized that facts are interpretations, the entire apparatus of social control would collapse. Education couldn't function by teaching authorized truths. Media couldn't function by claiming to report objective reality. Politics couldn't function by appealing to universal values. Religion couldn't function by claiming divine truth. Science couldn't function by claiming to discover nature's laws. Every institution that depends on truth, claims to justify its authority, would be exposed as just one perspective among many. And people would be free to reject those perspectives and create their own. This is why Nietzsche was and still is so controversial. Not because his ideas are wrong, but because they're threatening. They threaten the entire structure of social order that depends on most people believing in objective truth and submitting to authority that claims to represent it. Now let's address a common objection. If there are no facts, only interpretations, doesn't that mean everything is relative? Doesn't that mean truth is whatever you want it to be? Doesn't that lead to chaos where everyone just believes whatever suits them? And the answer is no, that is a misunderstanding. Nietzsche isn't saying all interpretations are equal. He is saying all interpretations are perspectival. Some perspectives are more useful than others. Some interpretations give you more power than others. Some frameworks enable more creation, more life, more growth than others. The question isn't, is this true in some absolute sense? The question is, what does this interpretation do? What kind of life does it enable? What kind of person does it create? A person who believes the world is fundamentally hostile will live differently than someone who believes the world is fundamentally neutral. Are either of those beliefs objectively true? No, they're interpretations, but they're not equal in their consequences. One might lead to constant anxiety and defensive behavior. The other might lead to openness and exploration. You choose based on consequences, not correspondence to some imaginary objective reality. This is what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values. Instead of discovering values out there in the world, or receiving them from God, or deriving them from reason, you create values. You decide what matters. What is worth pursuing? What kind of life is worth living? And you take full responsibility for those choices. Most people never do this. They inherit their values from their culture, their family, their religion, their education. They never question whether those values serve them or limit them. They just obey. But the free spirit, Nietzsche, is term for the person who breaks from the herd, questions everything. Where did this value come from? Who benefits from me believing this? Does this value increase my power or constrain it? And they reserve the right to reject any value that doesn't serve their will to power, their drive toward growth and creation and life. Let me give you another practical application. Consider the modern obsession with authenticity. Be yourself. Be authentic. Express your true self. This is presented as an unquestionable truth, a moral imperative, but Nietzsche would ask, what if there is no true self? What if the self is not something you discover, but something you create? What if authenticity is just another form of herd morality, a way of limiting your potential by trapping you in a fixed identity from a Nietzschean perspective? You're not a fixed essence that you need to discover and express. You're a process, a becoming, a constant creation. And committing to authenticity, to being yourself, might actually prevent you from becoming who you could be. It might lock you into patterns and identities that no longer serve you. So instead of seeking your authentic self, you consciously construct yourself. You experiment, you transform, you become multiple things. You wear masks. Not because you're being fake, but because you understand that all identities are masks. All selves are constructions. And you choose to construct yourself deliberately rather than unconsciously accepting the self that was constructed for you by circumstance. This connects directly to social engineering and psychological manipulation, because manipulators rely on you having a fixed sense of self with predictable values, desires, and fears. Once they know your identity, they can manipulate you by appealing to it or threatening it. They can say, real Americans believe X, real Christians do Y, real success looks like Z. And if you're invested in that identity, you'll conform to the expectations associated with it. But if you understand that identity is fluid, constructed, chosen, then these manipulation tactics lose their power. You can shift your identity situationally. You can wear different masks in different contexts. Not inauthentically, but strategically. Understanding that all authenticity is already a performance. This is advanced psychological warfare, operating outside the categories that others use to predict and control you. Let's return to the genealogical method, because this is one of Nietzsche's most powerful tools. Genealogy means tracing ideas back to their origins to expose the power relations embedded in them. When someone presents you with a truth, with a fact, with a value, you ask, where did this come from? Who created it? In what historical context? What problem was it solving? Whose interests did it serve? And often what you discover is that truths presented as eternal and universal are actually quite recent and particular. They emerged in specific circumstances to serve specific purposes, and they're maintained because they continue to serve those purposes. For example, the idea that hard work leads to success. This is presented as an objective fact about the world. Work hard and you'll prosper. But if you trace the genealogy of this idea, you find it emerged during industrialization. Capitalists needed workers to accept long hours in factories. So they promoted the work ethic. Hard work is virtuous. Laziness is sinful. Success proves moral worth. This interpretation served the interests of factory owners perfectly. It made workers blame themselves for poverty rather than questioning the system. And it became so embedded in culture that people stopped seeing it as an interpretation. It became truth. But it is not truth. It is ideology, an interpretation that benefits certain groups while limiting others. This is the power of genealogical thinking. It denaturalizes. It reveals that things presented as natural, inevitable, objective, are actually historical, contingent, constructed. And once you see that, you can question it, change it, reject it. This is why those in power hate genealogy. It exposes their truths as interested interpretations. It reveals the man behind the curtain. It shows that the emperor has no clothes. Every system of power depends on its values and truths appearing natural and inevitable. Genealogy shows they're neither. And this is liberating, because if something was constructed, it can be deconstructed. If something was created, it can be changed. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is eternal. Everything is open to reinterpretation and transformation. Now we need to talk about one of the most misunderstood aspects of Nietzsche, his thought. His relationship to truth itself. Some people think Nietzsche was against truth entirely, that he was a nihilist who believed nothing matters. But that is wrong. Nietzsche wasn't against truth in the sense of accuracy or usefulness. He was against truth with a capital T, against the idea of absolute, universal, eternal truth that transcends perspective. He was against the worship of truth, against the idea that truth is always good and valuable, against the belief that we should pursue truth for its own sake regardless of consequences. Nietzsche asked a question that shocked his contemporaries. What if truth isn't always beneficial? What if some truths are harmful? What if some illusions are necessary for life? Consider this. If someone is dying and in pain, is it better to tell them the harsh truth about their condition or to offer comforting illusions? If knowing the truth about human psychology makes you cynical and depressed, is that truth valuable? If facing certain realities leads to paralysis and nihilism, should we face them? Nietzsche's point isn't that we should lie. It is that we should evaluate truth claims by their effects, not by their correspondence to some imagined objective reality. Some interpretations enhance life, others diminish it. Choose accordingly. This brings us to Nietzsche's concept of life, affirming versus life, denying philosophies. He divided all philosophical and religious systems into two categories: those that say yes to life, to the body, to desire, to power, to growth, to becoming, and those that say no to life, that deny the body, repress desire, worship weakness, seek escape from existence. Christianity, in Nietzsche's view, was the ultimate life, denying philosophy. It taught that the physical world is inferior, that the body is sinful, that desires are evil, that suffering is redemptive, that true life comes after death. This is a resounding no to existence, a rejection of life in favor of an imaginary afterlife. And Nietzsche saw this as psychological poison, a way of making people hate their own lives, their own bodies, their own existence. And why would any philosophy promote this? Because life-denying values serve those in power. If you teach people to accept suffering in this life for rewards in the next, they won't rebel against injustice. They'll endure it. They'll be obedient, controllable. This is the genealogy of Christian morality. It is slave morality, a moral system that glorifies weakness to prevent slaves from rebelling, and it became so dominant, so internalized, that even when people stopped believing in God, they kept the values. Secular humanism, democratic idealism, social justice movements, all of them, Nietzsche argued, are Christianity without God, still promoting self-sacrifice, guilt, compassion for the weak, suspicion of power and success, still fundamentally life-denying even though they claim to be progressive and liberating. Nietzsche's alternative was life affirmation. Amor fati, love of fate, saying yes to existence exactly as it is, not trying to escape into imaginary better worlds, not waiting for justice in heaven or utopia on earth, but embracing this life, this world, this body, with all its pain and chaos and uncertainty. This isn't naive optimism. It is not pretending suffering doesn't exist. It is accepting suffering as part of existence and finding meaning and power anyway. This is the essence of the will to power. Not power over others, but power to create, to transform, to impose your interpretation on chaos and make something beautiful or meaningful or strong. The Faber-Mensch doesn't need truth handed down from authorities, doesn't need morality imposed from outside, doesn't need meaning provided by religion or ideology. The Faber-Mensch creates meaning, creates values, creates self. This is the ultimate freedom Nietzsche offers, and it is terrifying. Because with that freedom comes total responsibility. You can't blame God or nature or society for your life. You are the creator of your life. You are responsible for your interpretations, your values, your meanings. Most people can't handle that level of freedom, so they flee back into the comfort of external authority, back into truth, back into facts, back into the herd. And this is where we come full circle, back to the original insight. There are no facts, only interpretations. This isn't a statement of despair. It is a statement of power, because if everything is interpretation, then you have the power to choose your interpretations. You're not trapped by reality. You're not limited by truth. You're free to construct your own reality through the perspectives you adopt and the meanings you create. But most people never realize this. They spend their entire lives seeking truth when they should be wielding interpretation. They search for facts when they should be creating frameworks. They want to discover what is real when they should be constructing what is possible. And this keeps them weak, dependent, controllable, because they need someone else to tell them what is true. This is the final lesson. Truth is a tool of control, and seeking truth is submitting to control. The alternative isn't chaos. It is sovereignty, intellectual independence, the power to think for yourself, to question everything, to reject any interpretation that doesn't serve your will to power, to operate outside the categories and frameworks that others use to predict and control you. This is what Cortex Underground is about. Not teaching you new truths to replace old truths, but teaching you to operate beyond truth entirely, to see the game, to understand how facts are manufactured and enforced, to recognize the power dynamics hidden inside every truth claim, and to liberate yourself from the need for truth so you can create your own meanings and live according to your own will. This is the hardest thing most people will ever try to do, because every instinct, every conditioning, every social pressure pushes you to seek certainty, to find truth, to submit to authority. But if you can resist that pressure, if you can sit with uncertainty and still act powerfully, if you can create your own values without external validation, then you become dangerous. Not dangerous to others, dangerous to systems of control, because you can't be manipulated through appeals to truth. You can't be guilted through appeals to morality. You can't be frightened through appeals to facts. You operate by your own logic, your own values, your own interpretation. And that makes you immune to the primary weapons of social control. That is the real power of understanding Nietzsche. Not philosophical knowledge for its own sake, but practical psychological warfare. Defense against manipulation, liberation from the truth trap, and the beginning of genuine intellectual sovereignty.